Welcome to Westminster Watch. I'm Nick de Bois, and coming up on the show, the official public inquiry into the UK's handling of the COVID-19 pandemic is underway, and it's unearthed some shocking findings. The hearings describe a government that was ill-prepared to deal with the crisis, a Prime Minister who spoke of letting the bodies pile high. So what lessons can be learned for future outbreaks? About 230,000 people lost their lives. The country locked down 3 times, and a $90 billion furlough plan was implemented. In the UK, the cost of dealing with COVID has reached the point where people want answers. An official public inquiry is looking into the handling of the pandemic, and already former Prime Minister Boris Johnson appears to be absorbing most of the blame. Witnesses have pointed to his poor grasp of the science behind COVID, exhausting policy U-turns and indecision when confronted with tough choices. Here's what 2 of Johnson's top aides told the hearings.
I think at that point, and that's quite a strong thing to say, I think what will probably be clear in COVID, it was the wrong crisis for this Prime Minister's skill set.
The Cabinet Office was a bomb site, and we had a huge problem of quality control of documents going into meetings, and inconsistent data, inconsistent facts being read out. And many officials have come to me and said, this is causing chaos. There has to be some a formalised system to actually grip this, because the Cabinet Office was a dumpster fire.
One of the statistics scientists have used to evaluate countries' responses to the COVID pandemic is called excess mortality. And compared to its peers in Western Europe, the UK appears to have fared among the worst. While it had similar lockdown restrictions to many of its neighbours, excess mortality was significantly higher across the 2 years of the pandemic. Sweden, which famously did not lock down, fared better despite having fewer restrictions in place. The COVID inquiry is meant to help the UK government learn the lessons of the COVID pandemic and be prepared for the next one. While most of this will be dealt with in future strands of the inquiry, some takeaways are already emerging. The British Medical Journal recommends the civil service, local government and the care sector must be more involved in crucial decisions, and that systemic changes are made across the board. The inquiry's final report is not likely to be published until 2027. Now, let's bring in our panel. Kulveer Ranger is a Conservative member of the House of Lords. We also have former Labour MP Roger Casale and Senior Clinical Lecturer at University of Exeter Medical School, Dr Bharat Panghania. Gentlemen, hello.
Hello.
Well, let me kick off, if I may, with you, Roger, as a former Member of Parliament. We know that the UK COVID-19 inquiry was set up principally to examine both the response to and the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic and very much learn lessons for the future. But if I'm blunt, the news has been dominated by little more than tittle-tattle, gossip, discussions about who said what about who. Yes, there have been strong revelations that point to dysfunctional government. But if we're learning lessons for the future, what's the point if none of the main players in politics are ever going to be near government again? What are we really learning from all this tittle-tattle?
I agree with you, Nick. I mean, everyone loves a scapegoat, but I think this focus on personalities is absolutely exhausting. I feel exhausted by it. Perhaps you do, and perhaps our viewers do as well. But I think it is relevant to the broader inquiry because it's not that anybody has learned anything new about Boris Johnson from the inquiry. We knew what type of person was beforehand, and it's no surprise that he was the wrong man in the wrong place at the wrong time when it came to COVID. I don't think that's news in itself, but I think particularly some of the revelations that come out from Dominic Cummings and the way he's speaking, that does feed into the question about how government works, because you can't just sweep that under the carpet as tittle-tattle. It was a toxic place to work, and there were people behaving in ways that were toxic, that were making it worse. Nevertheless, I think we do have to stand back from it and look at the bigger picture. And I think what the public want to know is, why did so many people die? Why did they die in such a horrible way? And what are we going to change in government so that we have a more resilient system in the future?
Well, I certainly will discuss that a little bit more in future about what people want to know. But can I ask you, Kulveer Ranger, you worked with Boris Johnson. Let me just read this to you, because I want to ask you if this is the Boris Johnson you recognise. Martin Reynolds, you mentioned, Roger, some of his staff around him. He was Boris Johnson's close aide, civil servant. Johnson, he says, blew hot and cold over restrictions, presided over a culture of dysfunction and misogyny in Number 10, and indeed went on to leave Simon Cases, the Cabinet Secretary's predecessor, Sir Mark Sedwell, feeling he was being scapegoated by Johnson for the failure, as he believes he was forced out. Is that the Boris Johnson you recognise?
Not really, look. Nick, I spent 4 years at City Hall working with Boris when he was Mayor of London. A very small team running one of the big cities of the world with a lot of pressure on us, and actually a lot of us learning for the first time what political leadership, what challenges we'd face, from economic challenges, challenges of delivering the Olympics, even when there were riots in the city. And you have to have a strong team and a leader who can then make decisions and be advised well by that team. And it's generally regarded that that was quite a good era for the city. We had a really good...
So did he not have a good team around?
Well, I think we do have to look at the team, because there's a lot of focus on Boris himself as an individual. And if we're going to say that everything that went wrong is down to one individual, I think that's a bit much. I think, yes, he's Prime Minister. Yes, he will say the buck stops with him. But you have to take responsibility of the team of people around him, those in Number 10, and I quite agree with Roger about maybe some of the characters weren't up to the job. You know, it looks like from their evidence, they're sort of self-declaring some of the challenges they faced and how they maybe couldn't deal with them. But then we had the broader power of Whitehall, thousands of civil servants in and around the country that are meant to be helping the government deliver against this challenge, not just this country, but all countries facing this challenge. So, yes, we've had the tittle-tattle, I think, as you put it, around what's been coming out. But I think we need to get to more of the answers about processes, understanding and capability.
So you're do.
So, listen, I hear you. When Johnson was at Westminster City Hall, he had to be forced to come home during the riots. This gentleman has got a track record, a very long track record. He has never been suitable for high office. Nevertheless, he made it to high office.
With all
and
due
we mustn't
respect,
forget.
with all due respect, I was there.
Yeah.
He wasn't forced to come home. He was in a Winnebago in the deepest, darkest Canada, and we were trying to get hold of him. And as soon as we got hold of him, he was coming back. The rest of us were at a wedding of a colleague in Spain. I came back. It was August. Actually, none of the government were here either. So I think that's a misrepresentation of what happened there. Forgive me, but just correct that.
A long track record.
No,
he spent a lot of his time on his bikes visiting somebody else with whom he was having an affair rather than attending to the issues.
Dr. Pangani, again, I hear what you're saying, but isn't that just more of the sort of tittle-tattle that is what the inquiry's been focusing on? Wouldn't you, as a public health expert, apart from anything else, want to be looking at other issues rather than hearing about all this stuff?
It's tragic. We're mired in the sleaze of Johnson and his cabal and everything else, and it is terrible because the United Kingdom is much better than that. We want to hear about the root cause analysis of what went wrong. So I, as an expert in these things, we spent years planning for these things. We never expected the UK response to be as poor, as disjointed, as scattergunned as it started to become.
Now, the government would say that they led their response by following the science. I cannot begin to think how many times, as a public, we suffered to hear that. So are the scientists wrong as well? Because they were driving the policy. Johnson's critics say he listened to them too much.
Let us put it another way. They said they followed the science. That doesn't mean they were following the scientific advice from their own scientific committee. OK, let me give you...
You're talking about SAGE.
Indeed,
yeah.
Indeed, and others. Let me give an example. We are well trained in this art and craft of contact tracing, containment, etc. Okay? So the virus arrives, we have no control measures in reducing its spread. Secondly, we start contact tracing. Then suddenly, the chief medical officer says, we're not doing contact tracing anymore, we don't need to. Then about 4 weeks later, test and trace has been set up, and suddenly we're back on doing test and trace. Whereas all our plans have always indicated that the test and trace and containment would start, and it would start from the local offices, which we did really well, successfully, at minimal cost, if we allowed the local health protection units to run the show. Instead, a centralised test and trace system was set up, which was never going to work.
Can I add in there? Because I think there's 3 points to make around this. One is, this was all theory in advance. We'd never faced this kind of pandemic before. And so when the rubber hit the road here, we found some of it appears, and we'll hopefully go through the inquiry and discover a bit more about this. What was the actual capability that would have been there to set it up?
No,
secondly,
I disagree.
Well, OK, but secondly, I think, you know, a lot of the advice that was being given from SAGE, yes, it's medical, it's scientific, but the government has to look at also the health of the nation, the economic health of the nation, and balance some other considerations as well. So although we get the advice, that has to then be looked in the context of what's good for the government. Well, finally, I just want to say one other thing, is in the context of what every other country was also doing generally. And we tended to be in lockstep in understanding what they were doing and learning from each other.
I think, look, if I may, just one thing, if I may, because
Yeah.
I think I want to bring Roger in here. Roger, you know that the central charge here being made is what happened in terms of outcomes. But actually, is government fit the way it's set up to actually support a Prime Minister to make those decisions? Because we could argue that the scientists were giving the advice, the Chief Medical Officer was giving advice about how to do the test and tracing. We don't elect Prime Ministers because they're scientists. They have to make decisions. Isn't Johnson perhaps only guilty of varying his decisions?
Look, I think that Johnson didn't acquit himself well, to put it mildly, or the people around him, and he needs to be continually held to account. And that's a big part of the problem. But once you take that away, there's still a big part of the problem is still there. And I think it does have to do with our system of government. And so I think the focus needs to be not just on who's to blame for what happened, but who can take responsibility for putting the system of government right in the future. And I think there is a very important question to ask about how we relate to people who know about this, how government does, how it works with scientists and experts. And if I may say so, I think I'd also be very interested to know about what we need to learn about the technology and how technology works in government and how that can help better decisions and implementation of those decisions, because it's not just a question about decisions, also about the implementation and the delivery of those decisions. But if I may, Nick, I think also let's remember that the public need to be consulted much more as well, and not just have decisions taken over the top of their head. And local government and local councils, in your experience in London, the closer you are to the ground, the closer you are to the real experience of people's lives, the more you're going to learn. Let's have a bit more. Listen a bit more to the experts, and let's have a bit more of the wisdom of the crowd.
I think we all remember well the debate on localism. Come back in on
So look, what I was going to say, Johnson missed 5 Cobra meetings, right, in the middle of a crisis that we've never experienced before. Furthermore, all these exercises that we spent millions of pounds on practicing for a Factor X, a virus that is going to start circulating, killing people. So why were we wasting our energy on doing all these exercises if you are not going to implement the findings of these exercises?
That's what the inquiry needs to get to the bottom of, rather than focusing on the personalities. Because the personalities weren't saying don't use that knowledge, but also, I agree with you, Roger, about the process. I think we have to be careful between deciding, is our political process not right, or are the systems that support the political process? And I would look at the systems, because whether it's COVID,
it could be both.
It could be. But whether it's COVID, whether it's things like HS2, big programmes, whether it's how we run the NHS, I think we have big questions and challenges to face about how we will do these things in the future, as well as you were saying, and obviously I'm close to having spent a career in technology, more technology coming in. And I recently gave my maiden speech in the House of Lords, and one of the points I made was what we do in Parliament will now have to sit alongside what happens outside Parliament, what some global businesses decide. We will not be able to lead and direct. We'll have to work in partnership with the private sector, with other third-party bodies, especially when we face big crises
now,
like this.
Gentlemen, if I may, I think we're going to build on a theme here, because you rightly brought us back to what the COVID inquiry should be asking. But let me turn to you, if I may. I was very interested in something Professor Carol Sikora said, a very respected oncologist. And he was saying that the problem is with the panel of inquiry is that it is not able to assess itself the scientific decisions that ruled our response. And therefore, there is a shortcoming in how you answer some of the key questions around the public health decisions were made. So, that would mean the science behind lockdown. Bearing in mind, people were doing this for the very first time. The decision to close our schools. Shouldn't the inquiry be actually challenging and learning and maybe agreeing with the scientific evidence that was presented that led to catastrophic impact on our lives?
Of course it should, and it should do it like this. We need answers, and we need answers very, very quickly about what went right, what went wrong, what we call a root cause analysis. And then you have an inquiry which looks into the other elements, which we also need answering, such as the lockdown. When did you order the lockdown? Why did you order it so late? And therefore, what were the consequences?
Actually, can I stop you there? Because I remember this debate ferociously, that there was an argument put forward that, judging by all the mobile data that was out there, that actually the public had locked down before Johnson ordered it.
Of course.
And therefore, in fact, it was questioning, in fact, the reality and the benefit of lockdown. Now, that was all shut down as a discussion, and the rush to agree with each other. Isn't that what the inquiry should be challenging?
It should. But let me just capitalise on this thing, which is this. All these were in our plans, okay, about movement restrictions, etc.
Can I just say, these are the plans, for clarity, that were made years in advance.
Emergency preparedness plans, we make them.
Yeah.
What was never in the plans, and it suddenly appeared, and it hurts me to this day, is people died alone. That we make these plans to be kind.
Because of lockdown.
Not only lockdown, but people died alone in hospitals, in nursing homes, in care homes. People were isolated. This was never in the plans. And those draconian restrictions, whereby you may not see your loved one taking their last breath because you may not come to the hospital and hold their hand, it's absolutely outrageous.
Isn't that the point? That was what the Prime Minister was grappling with. He was grappling with that. There's a tragedy of how these lockdowns would be applied.
But he was the Prime Minister. He should have done something about it.
Why he was but he was also thinking about the mental health of the nation, the mental health, and he was making that point in those debates.
But people died alone.
And he was also, I know, but as Nick highlighted, the herd moved towards a lockdown mentality generated by the advice that was being received.
He is the Prime Minister. He can change things at the flip of a switch.
But if he did that without the scientific advice to back him up that he was receiving from SAGE, who wanted to lock us down...
Hold on.
Then
it's very
surely
easy.
He'd be criticised.
Hold on. Let me explain. This is not rocket science. Your loved one is dying, okay? And there is a blanket restriction across all the hospitals and all the other places that you may not hold their hand. Who made that lousy rule? Why? And as a Prime Minister, you can see, my goodness me, my citizens are dying alone. This is going to cause a lot of problems.
Fair enough. You've asked for political judgments to be made by people when it came to looking at the tragedy of letting someone die alone. The clamour for the vaccine was right up there. I remember German papers complimenting us on leaving the European Union because we got jabs in first.
This has nothing to do with the European Union.
But it's what they said. I'm not saying it's anything to do with them.
And we've had this spouted over and over again that we are out of the European Union, therefore we got in first. It is absolute nonsense.
But I'm not saying that. I'm not saying that.
So let's make it clear.
No, I'm not saying that.
Yes.
And there's and it'd be wrong to turn it into that.
Yes.
I am saying at the time the clamour for the vaccine was so huge that even our European neighbours were writing how they had been let down compared to Britain because he got the jabs in the arms first. I think it's easy to forget that, don't you?
Okay. Let's accept this. Whilst we may have got the vaccine program started first before the European partners, actually the European partners within a month overtook us in terms of the number of people immunized with the vaccines that they also had available. Okay? So it wasn't a case of a big chasm, a big divide. The Europeans were nearly with us. The point that we got there first because we were out of the European Union is null and void.
Fair enough. Lively exchange on that one. Let me ask you, Roger, okay, with your political instincts, if the British public are going to be disappointed like me because we will never really know if the science backed up the decision to lock down, etc., do you think the British public would ever lock down again?
What a great question, and who can know the answer? And I think it points to why this inquiry is so important. And I think it also points to the point you made earlier about trusting the public more and getting into a conversation with the public. And I think each and every MP, constituency MP in Britain knows from the conversations that they have on the doorstep and in community halls and so on, that the electorate, the public, are grown-ups. They can take no for an answer, but they don't want to have their point of view and their experience not taken into account. And so we need to have a much broader and deeper public debate about what we should do next time, so that this isn't forced on people, but that we actually develop an element of consensus. And I think that's where the effort needs to go, to actually educating the public, engaging the public, and I think local authorities have got to take the lead with this, so that we are really have the public on side and respected and engaged and brought into the decision-making process next time.
Roger, on that point, and this is another point that really hurts, because I've been in this business a long time, okay? Yeah. So we have a network, we have the National Health Service, we have the primary care system, we have the local authorities, we have environmental health officers, etc., already in post, okay? And we do this as our bread and butter every day. Come the pandemic, Matt Hancock excluded the primary care people, excluded the physicians from the hospitals, excluded the local authorities, and he sets up his standalone test and trace, which was never in the plans. So we already have the infrastructure. We know how these things work, and they were all dismantled. In fact, it was so bad that he also dismantled Public Health England in the middle of a pandemic. How crazy is that?
Dr. Panghania, do you think, if, God forbid, we have another pandemic, 50 years, 100 years, do you think the first place politicians and scientists will go when they start to manage it will be this inquiry document when it's published?
I hope not. My reasons are this was catastrophically incorrectly executed for a country like the United Kingdom, because the United Kingdom excels with emergency preparedness. We are very good. And we found that the emperor had no clothes when the pandemic struck. So we suddenly found that, considering exercise sickness had said, we have a shortage of beds, we have a shortage of PPE stored, we have a shortage of expert personnel. None of those things were addressed by our current Chancellor of the Exchequer, Jeremy Hunt, who was at Health. None of those issues were addressed. And we'd like to ask him why not. So would we use this as a benchmark for future preparedness? It would be a benchmark of how not to do it.
Roger, you're parliamentarian. Do you think that our Parliament will actually, if it's faced this in the future, look at that and say, that is how not to do it, and perhaps be better prepared? Is Parliament too short-term to even think like that?
No, I think Parliament can do that. I think Parliament should do that. And I hope that the response will be statesmanlike and put the public first and at the centre. I mean, you know, you might give Boris Johnson's government 1 out of 10, 2 out of 10. That's not a defence of what he did. That's a very poor performance. But, you know, the reason he performed bad is partly to do with him, partly to do with other things. And any other government that comes in the future is going to face those challenges.
Well,
so before you start leaping to make party political points about this, I think we need to understand that actually there's a lot here that needs to put right that isn't to do with party politics, even that the way that this particular government
I think if I might say,
gentlemen, how do we address that? We have to do that together. So I hope there's a degree of humility.
General, I think your point
that's important.
Is absolute. I think we've established more than the inquiry has done, and I think that is a note of consensus we would all agree in. Lord Kulveer Ranger, thank you very much indeed for joining us. Roger Casale, and of course Dr. Parrot Bankhania.
Thank you.
Thank you again for joining me. And don't forget to check out TRT World on YouTube for more lively debate and conversation. But for now, from me and all the team here, goodbye and thank you for watching.